In the winter of 1888, an Ojibwe elder realized he was nearing the end of his life. Knowing he had little time left, he asked his grandson to write down everything he was about to say. According to the grandson, the conversation lasted 3 days. What the old man wanted preserved was not family history or tribal genealogy, but a detailed account of the ancient copper country around Lake Superior and the people he believed had worked it long before living memory. The elder spoke about mining pits that were already ancient when his own grandfather was young, shoreline structures that no longer existed, and a tradition that insisted the copper mines had never truly been abandoned. They had simply passed from one generation of custodians to another. 3 weeks after those conversations ended, the elder died, leaving behind a written record that asked a question archaeologists are still debating today. By the late 19th century, government surveys had already confirmed that thousands of prehistoric copper mines surrounded Lake Superior. Stone hammerstones, evidence of fire setting and deep excavations showed that enormous amounts of copper had been extracted centuries before Europeans reached the Great Lakes. The existence of the mines was no longer in doubt. Explaining the scale of the operation was another matter entirely. The old man believed historians were asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering who discovered the mines, he believed they should have been asking who first opened them, how such an enormous enterprise had been organized, and why so much of the copper appeared to have disappeared. More than a century later, those questions remain unanswered. Today we're examining the testimony recorded during those final 3 days, alongside the archaeological evidence from Lake Superior, to explore one of North America's oldest and most enduring historical mysteries. For most of his life, the Ojibwe elder avoided talking about the ancient copper workings around Lake Superior. Surveyors asked him about them as government expeditions pushed deeper into the region. Missionaries were curious about the old pits they had seen hidden beneath the forests. Later, mining men arriving from the eastern United States asked many of the same questions, hoping local knowledge might lead them to new deposits. The elder rarely encouraged those conversations. He was willing to explain fishing grounds, canoe routes, winter crossings, and the seasonal movements of animals. But when the discussion turned toward the old copper mines, he usually became quiet or changed the subject altogether. That changed during the winter of 1888. By then his family knew he was dying, and according to his grandson's account, the old man understood it as well. Rather than allowing decades of inherited knowledge to disappear with him, he asked his grandson to write down everything he was about to say. The request surprised the family because this was not meant to be an ordinary conversation remembered years later. He wanted a written record, something that could survive after every person in the room was gone. For the next 3 days, the grandson carefully recorded his grandfather's words as they moved through places, events, and traditions that the old man believed stretched far beyond living memory. Much of what the elder described centered on places scattered across the Lake Superior region. He spoke about old workings on the Keweenaw Peninsula that were already considered ancient before industrial mining reached the area. He described locations on Isle Royale that his grandson had never visited, and shoreline features that no longer existed in the form remembered by earlier generations. These were not presented as legends or sacred stories. He spoke about them as familiar places whose history had gradually slipped beyond the reach of ordinary memory. By the late 19th century, the existence of these prehistoric mines was already well established. Government surveys had documented thousands of excavation pits throughout the Lake Superior basin. Archaeologists and geologists had recovered heavy stone hammerstones, wooden supports preserved beneath the ground, and evidence that miners had repeatedly used fire to fracture solid rock before removing native copper. No serious investigator doubted that an enormous mining industry had once existed there. The uncertainty lay elsewhere. Researchers struggled to explain how societies generally described as small and scattered could have organized extraction on such an extraordinary scale. The elder listened to those debates but believed they were built on the wrong starting point. According to his grandson's notes, he repeatedly returned to the same idea. People kept asking who had discovered the mines, when that was never the real mystery. The copper deposits around Lake Superior were visible in many places and had been known for generations. The more important question was who had first organised the work, opened the deep excavations and transformed scattered outcrops into one of the largest prehistoric mining districts in North America. That distinction mattered because in his understanding the mines had not been founded by his people, they had been inherited. That word appears again and again in the surviving account, inherited. The elder did not describe the Ojibwe as the creators of the copper country. He described them as the custodians of places that were already old when the oldest remembered traditions began. To him, the mines belonged to a history that reached beyond his own ancestors, into a period he referred to only as the time before the silence. It was a phrase his grandson carefully preserved because his grandfather repeated it several times, yet never fully explained what it meant. Even decades later, the grandson admitted that every mention of those words seemed to change the old man's expression in a way that was difficult to put into writing. By the end of the first day, the grandson realized he was no longer listening to a history of the Ojibwe alone. He was listening to the account of an older world that his grandfather believed had existed before the stories most people considered ancient had even begun. And naturally, that raised the question he could no longer keep to himself. If the Ojibwe inherited the mines, who had worked them first? The question lingered in the room for a long time before the old man answered. His grandson would later write that his grandfather remained silent long enough for him to wonder whether he had asked something that should not have been asked at all. When the elder finally spoke, his reply was short, but it shaped everything that followed over the next 2 days. The first miners, he said, came from the direction where the sun is oldest. The grandson wrote the sentence exactly as he heard it because he immediately realized he did not know how to interpret it. The elder offered no map, no name, and no explanation. He simply continued with the account, assuming the meaning would become clearer as the story unfolded. On the second day, the conversation shifted away from memory and towards something much more practical. The elder was not interested in legends for their own sake. He wanted his grandson to think about the scale of the mining itself. He had never read a geological survey, studied archaeology, or seen the reports that government investigators were beginning to publish about the ancient workings around Lake Superior. Yet he had spent his entire life living beside those lakes, watching people move timber, launch canoes, build camps, and survive through long northern winters. He understood how much labour even an ordinary project demanded. That experience shaped the way he looked at the old mines. To him, they represented an organisation far larger than most people appreciated. By the time these conversations took place, the archaeological evidence had already become difficult to dismiss. Thousands of prehistoric mining pits had been identified across Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula. Heavy stone hammerstones, some weighing more than 20 pounds, had been recovered beside exposed copper veins. Archaeologists found widespread evidence of fire setting, a technique in which rock was heated with large fires before being rapidly cooled to fracture the stone and expose the native copper inside. In several locations, the excavations extended across such large areas that early surveyors struggled to determine where one mining operation ended and another began. None of that surprised the elder. What surprised him was how often people admired the mines without asking what it would have taken to operate them. Excavating thousands of pits is not simply a matter of finding copper. Every tool must be made, every worker must be fed. Timber has to be cut, fires maintained, stone removed, and the extracted metal transported across islands, forests, and shorelines. Work on that scale cannot be sustained by a few isolated families returning whenever they happen to have free time. It requires planning that lasts beyond a single season and knowledge that survives beyond a single generation. That was the point the old man believed many investigators were overlooking. The grandson later recalled that his grandfather returned repeatedly to one simple question: where did the copper go? Copper is unusually durable. Unlike wood, it does not rot. Unlike iron, it does not disappear beneath rust after a few generations. If enormous quantities of native copper had been removed from the Lake Superior region, the archaeological record should preserve evidence of that extraction somewhere. And some evidence certainly exists. Artifacts made from Lake Superior copper have been recovered from sites stretching across North America. Archaeologists have identified the metal in Ohio, Illinois, Louisiana, and many other regions connected through ancient trade networks. Those discoveries demonstrate that copper moved across remarkable distances long before European contact. But the scale of that trade still appears smaller than the scale of the mining itself. That imbalance is what continued to trouble the elder. According to his grandson's notes, the old man believed people had become so fascinated by the mines that they stopped asking how an enterprise of this size could have functioned for centuries. The real mystery was never the existence of the copper. It was the society capable of organizing its extraction. And as the grandson listened, he began to understand that his grandfather believed the answer lay not in the mines themselves, but in the people who had first transformed the copper country into one of the largest prehistoric industrial landscapes in North America. By the afternoon of the second day, the conversation returned to the people the elder had mentioned earlier, the ones who came from what he called the direction where the sun is oldest. His grandson hoped this time he would finally hear a name. Instead, the old man became even more careful with his words. According to the surviving notes, he explained that these earlier miners were not remembered as enemies, conquerors, or strangers who had taken the land by force. The traditions he inherited described something far more complicated. His ancestors and the earlier miners had shared the copper country. They understood the metal differently and used it for different purposes, but both groups recognized that the deposits surrounding Lake Superior were important enough to protect and important enough to remember. That distinction shaped the rest of the conversation. The grandson noticed that whenever people spoke about the mines, they usually focused on ownership, who found them, who controlled them, or who claimed them. His grandfather approached the subject from a different direction. He spoke about stewardship. To him, the copper country was not simply a resource waiting to be exhausted. It was something that had been entrusted to successive generations, each expected to care for it without forgetting the people who had worked there before. That idea explained why he had repeatedly described the mines as inherited rather than discovered. In his understanding, every generation became responsible for preserving something that was already ancient when they received it. Then the conversation reached one of the most unusual passages in the entire account. The elder told his grandson that the people before the silence did not simply remove copper from the earth. They listened to it. Years later, when the grandson reflected on those 3 days, he admitted he never fully understood what his grandfather intended by that phrase. The old man offered no further explanation, and the conversation moved on before he could ask for one. Rather than interpreting the words himself, the grandson chose to preserve them exactly as he had heard them, believing that changing the language would also change its meaning. The elder seemed to understand his grandson's confusion. According to the notes, he told him that not every part of an inherited tradition can be explained immediately. Some knowledge survives only because one generation carries it forward until another generation is finally able to understand it. His responsibility was not to solve every mystery or translate every unfamiliar idea into modern language. His responsibility was to make sure the account survived intact. That was why the old man had insisted on creating a written record instead of relying on memory alone. By the third morning, the grandson had changed the way he asked questions. He had realized that direct questions rarely produced direct answers. Instead, his grandfather would slowly add details, allowing the larger picture to emerge on its own. So when he returned once more to the identity of the first miners, he asked as simply as he could, who were they? The answer was the same. The elder never gave them a name. The grandson later admitted this frustrated him more than anything else because names can be compared with maps, languages, and historical records. Descriptions are far more difficult to investigate. All his grandfather would say was that they came from the direction where the sun is oldest, a phrase that appears several times throughout the surviving notes without further explanation. Whether it referred to a homeland across the water, a direction, or something else entirely remains impossible to determine from the document itself. What survives much more clearly is the elder's understanding of why they mined the copper. According to his grandson, he became noticeably impatient whenever people suggested that the ancient workings existed only to produce tools or trade goods. Copper was certainly useful, he agreed, but usefulness alone could not explain an enterprise that lasted for generations and transformed so much of the Lake Superior landscape. Thousands of mining pits, countless stone hammers, centuries of organized labor. Projects of that scale require more than a valuable material. They require a society that places extraordinary importance on what it is extracting. In the elder's view, the copper itself occupied a central place in the world view of the first miners, although exactly why was one of the many details that had faded long before his own lifetime. Before the conversation moved on, the old man added one final observation that his grandson carefully underlined in his notes. The first miners, he said, built their important places close to the water because the lakes were as essential to the work as the mines themselves. He repeated that idea several times, but never explained precisely what role the water played. Decades later, the grandson admitted he could not translate that part of the conversation with complete confidence. He chose to record the words exactly as they were spoken, rather than replace them with an explanation his grandfather had never given. It was another reminder that some parts of the testimony survive as evidence of what was remembered, not necessarily as answers to what was meant. By the third day, the elder had spoken for hours about the people who worked the copper and the traditions that survived after they were gone. What he described next was different. For the first time, he stopped talking about how the copper country had been maintained and began explaining why that world eventually disappeared. He referred to this period with a simple expression that his grandson had heard several times before: the silence. It was not presented as a single battle, a natural disaster, or one dramatic event that ended an entire civilization overnight. Instead, the elder described it as a gradual break in memory. The people who had once understood the mines were no longer there. The knowledge passed from one generation to the next became incomplete, and eventually only fragments remained. By the time his own ancestors inherited the copper country, they knew the workings were ancient, but much of the history behind them had already been lost. The grandson later admitted this was one of the most difficult parts of his grandfather's testimony to record, because the elder often spoke as though he were describing the disappearance of knowledge rather than the disappearance of people. Villages can be abandoned, buildings can collapse, roads can vanish beneath forests, but when traditions stop being passed from parents to children, entire chapters of history can disappear even while the landscape itself remains unchanged. That, according to the elder, was the true meaning of the silence. As archaeologists continued investigating the Lake Superior region in the decades that followed, they encountered a pattern that echoed part of this description. Ancient mining pits were still visible across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale. Stone hammerstones remained scattered around exposed copper veins. Fire-broken rock continued to mark places where prehistoric miners had worked for generations. The physical evidence had survived. What had not survived was a written record explaining who organized these operations, or why they eventually came to an end. The elder believed that disappearance had changed the way later generations viewed the copper country. People saw abandoned pits and assumed they had always been abandoned. They found isolated artifacts and assumed they had always belonged to scattered communities. In his view, both conclusions overlooked the possibility that the surviving evidence represented only the final remains of something much larger. Time had reduced a complex landscape into disconnected pieces, making it difficult for later generations to recognize how those pieces had once fit together. Near the end of the third day, the grandson asked the question that had been following the entire conversation. If the first miners disappeared, what happened to the copper they removed? According to the notes, the elder did not claim to know the destination of every piece of metal. Instead, he warned against assuming that the answer could be found by looking only around Lake Superior. The mines, he believed, had always been part of a much larger world connected by travel and exchange. If investigators wanted to understand where the copper had gone, they would have to think beyond the boundaries of the mining district itself. That observation has remained relevant for archaeologists studying prehistoric trade. Copper traced to the Lake Superior region has been identified at archaeological sites hundreds and, in some cases, more than 1,000 miles away. These discoveries demonstrate that ancient exchange networks connected distant communities across much of eastern North America. At the same time, researchers continue debating whether those known trade routes fully account for the enormous quantity of copper believed to have been extracted from the prehistoric mines. It is a question that remains open because the archaeological record is still incomplete. As the conversation came to an end, the elder reminded his grandson that he was not asking future generations to accept every word simply because he had spoken it. He wanted them to remember that history is often measured not only by what survives, but also by what has been forgotten. The mines were still there, the hammerstones were still there, the copper had certainly been removed. What had disappeared was the complete story connecting all of those pieces together. 3 weeks after those conversations ended, the elder passed away. His grandson kept the handwritten notes, believing they contained something too important to lose. More than a century later, those pages remain one of the few surviving accounts from someone who believed the ancient copper mines were part of a much older history that had almost vanished from memory. Today, archaeologists agree that the prehistoric mines around Lake Superior are real. Thousands of excavation pit, stone hammerstones, and evidence of ancient mining have confirmed that enormous amounts of copper were removed long before European settlement. What remains uncertain is how such a vast operation was organized, how long it continued, and whether we have discovered the full story behind it. The elder never claimed to have every answer. He simply believed that history had forgotten some of the most important questions. Perhaps that is why his final request was not to preserve his name, but to preserve the story. And after more than 100 years, those questions are still waiting to be answered. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more forgotten history, consider subscribing. We'd also like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think first opened the ancient copper mines of Lake Superior, and where do you believe all that copper ultimately went?